Well, a very good afternoon and a very warm welcome to everyone to the IISS today. For those of you who didn't join us this morning, a very warm welcome indeed. And for those of you who attended our very good discussion earlier, this is a welcome back, and I hope you enjoyed the lunch. We meet today to discuss US policy in South Asia under President Trump. Like elsewhere in Asia, the emerging continuities and discontinuities in US policy in South Asia have the potential to significantly shape bilateral, intra- and inter-regional dynamics there. Since Donald Trump's election, I've been once to Pakistan and twice to India. Many of the private conversations I've had in that part of the world have squarely focused on trying to read President Trump's policy mind and intentions of what the priorities of his administrations may or may not be for South Asia. To address this broad issue, it's my great personal pleasure to welcome back to the IISS our esteemed colleagues from the NISA Center in the United States. Jack Gill and John Wood are regular visitors to Arundel House, but I'd like to especially welcome Gawdat, for whom this, I believe, is a first visit to Arundel House. For the last decade, the ISS has built a very strong partnership with the NISA Center to organize the annual 1.5-track South Asia Security Conference, which we hold in Oman. Some of you will have attended the meeting we also now convene at the end of the Oman conference here in London. The last 2 points I'd like to make before I pass over the floor to the three speakers is one point is to remind you that this entire meeting is on the record. The second point is to acknowledge the presence in this room of a number of officials, but especially from Afghanistan, His Excellency Jawed Kaim, Deputy Minister of Counter-Narcotics Policy and Coordination, and His Excellency Dr. Ahmad Jan Naeem, Deputy Minister of Public Health, also from Afghanistan. With this said, it's my great pleasure to now turn the floor over to our first speaker, Jack Gill. Over to you, Jack.
Well, thank you very much, Antoine. It's a great pleasure to be back here at the IISS and among such friends and good scholars on such a lovely day. And thank you for all coming here and enjoying the hospitality of IISS when you could be outside in the park on a beautiful afternoon. I'll note, please, that I speak in my personal capacity, although I, like my colleagues, am a U.S. government employee. What I have to say represents what I think and does not in any way, should not be taken in any way as representing the Near East South Asia Center, where we're all employed, or the National Defense University, the Defense Department, or any other branch of the United States government. I think what we'll do is we'll start with India, and that will be me, and then move west. So I'll begin with some observations on how relations seem to be shaping up with India and Pakistan as far as those two countries are concerned, and then we'll turn to my two colleagues looking to the west at Iran and Afghanistan. It's worth noting at the outset that we're still, of course, very much in the early days of the new U.S. administration. There are lots of new people, a lot of unfilled posts. So in some ways, the easy answer is to say, well, we just don't know yet what U.S. policy will look like. And there was little said in the campaign last year about South Asia per se, and not much in the way of substantive policy statements from Washington on the region as yet. Still, so in that sense, we don't have a whole lot upon which to ground our analysis. Nonetheless, I think we can outline a few trends and some likely directions, with perhaps a surprising degree of continuity in many respects. So again, starting with India, the U.S. and India, as many of you probably know, built a remarkably robust and broad-based relationship over all areas of government in the past 20 to 25 years, founded on common principles, democratic governance, and increasing convergence in international interests. The defense in this area where I have concentrated often gets the most attention because it's very visible, it's often very sensitive, and when we began, we had so far to go. And when we began in the mid-1990s, no one would have imagined that U.S. defense sales to India, as they are today, would be around $14 billion U.S. dollars, and that the United States would designate India a major defense partner, as it did last December on a trip of the then Defense Secretary to India. But defense is only one segment of a very wide-ranging relationship, and projects such as clean energy that do not get as much attention have made significant progress. India's National Security Advisor, Ajit Doval, and the Foreign Secretary, Mr. Jaishankar, have recently visited Washington and have given very favorable readouts of their visits. The U.S. Secretary of Defense and the India Raksha Mantri, or Minister of Defense, have spoken on the phone, and the two chief executives have spoken, with a pledge of a visit by Prime Minister Modi to the United States, possibly as early as sometime this year, 2017. So that's all to the good. The objective circumstances and converging interests that led the two countries to invest in this relationship in the beginning are still therefore relevant. And this suggests, as I mentioned, a considerable degree of continuity and the need to sustain the relationship, not to allow it to falter from lack of attention. From what we know so far of the new administration, we can likely expect, I think, considerable agreement on issues such as countering terrorism, concern for China's direction, growth in trade and investment between the United States and India, and I think we're also likely to see continued strong bipartisan support across the United States Congress for the U.S.-India relationship, as there has been in the past. So there's a lot upon which the two countries may build, but reading through the Indian press and American analyses outside of government, there are also concerns and uncertainties. Let me just touch on several of those. Although commerce and trade seem likely to be key elements of the relationship, it's not clear if this will be largely or solely on a bilateral basis or on a multilateral basis between the United States and India, or U.S., India, and others. Will the relationship be more transactionally based or short-term, or will the United States exhibit what one American analyst calls calculated altruism, locating the relationship in the ambit of global issues over the long haul? At the tactical end of the spectrum, I think we could see the U.S. visa and immigration policies as major irritants in the relationship. Even if those are transitory, they garner a lot of attention because they affect people's basic lives. At the strategic end, many Indians are clearly worried, from what I read in the Indian press, at the prospect of a significant U.S. retreat or disengagement from Asia and the potential impact on Indian economic and security interests if that were to take place. A number of American observers have voiced similar concerns. So that is not in the words of the U.S. administration, but in people trying to analyze where things may go in the near term. So those will be some of the issues to which the United States and India will have to adjust under this new administration. To keep in my time, I'll now shift west to Pakistan, where there have also been senior interactions between the United States and the government of Pakistan. For example, Ambassador Tariq Fatemi was in Washington for a considerable time early in this year, late last year, and there have been phone calls back and forth as well. But the foundations of the relationship are less solid, more up and down, and historically, and subject now to probably more fluctuation. Indeed, some American observers would argue that a transactional relationship between the U.S. and Pakistan, which used to be the bad word, if you will, in U.S.-Pakistan relations, might be better for both countries. That is, each would understand each other's interests and limitations more frankly and clearly. Pakistan, of course, remains very important in the region, in and of itself as a large nation with considerable economic potential, and as a crucial player in the stability in Afghanistan, either helpful or the adverse. There's some reporting today, for example, that Pakistan thinks it might be possible to revive the quadrilateral consultative group, U.S., China, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. We'll see if that comes to fruition. And there are collaborative elements, therefore, upon which the two countries can build, but managing expectations will continue to present challenges. At the same time, interests diverge in important ways in serious issues between U.S. and Pakistan. The most prominent of these is terrorism writ large, and specifically the threats to Afghan stability that Americans see in the Quetta Shura, the Haqqanis, and other groups based in Pakistan, as you can see from recent American policy statements. Not as prominent in the press, but equally troubling, is horizontal and vertical expansion of Pakistan's nuclear arsenal and delivery means. Largely, but not entirely owing to these issues, Pakistan faces tough challenges in the U.S. Congress and sometimes within the bureaucracy, so we can expect that requests for funding to economic as well as military support are likely to receive very close scrutiny, as we saw, in fact, this past year. Immigration will also be a concern for Pakistanis, especially if there's a perception of unfair treatment of Muslims in the United States or across the world, and so popular reaction inside Pakistan could cause problems for the government in Islamabad in dealing with the United States. Let me conclude with a final observation, in that I've spoken about the United States and India, and the United States and Pakistan in bilateral terms, but of course those two relationships exist within a larger regional and strategic context. And there are some key variables to consider. I can highlight just a couple of those. The most important here to me would be China. That is where the United States' relationship with Beijing will go, because that will certainly be read very closely in New Delhi and in Islamabad for the potential impact on Indian and Pakistani strategic interests, respectively. And as you probably know, the U.S. president and the Chinese president are due to meet either today or tomorrow, anyway, very soon this week in Florida. So what will that mean for India if the United States takes a more confrontational stance with China? How will the United States view the China-Pakistan economic corridor upon which so many of Pakistan's hopes are pinned? As you know, the U.S. in the previous administration had strongly supported the CPEC, or China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. How will that pan out in the new administration? We do not yet know. These and other questions with respect to China will be followed very closely in both capitals and across the region. We can make similar observations and ask similar questions about the resonance of U.S.-Russia relations and how the U.S. deals with other neighbors in the region, such as Iran, and we'll hear about it in a moment, the Gulf states, and the states of Southeast Asia in ASEAN. So these are some variables at the strategic level that we'll bear watching. But I think with Antoine's indulgence, my time is up, so I will say thanks again to IISS for hosting us and to all of you for attending, and turn things back to Antoine.
Thank you, Jack, and thank you for keeping to time. I'd like to now turn the floor over to Dr. Gawdat Bahgat for his own remarks.
Thank you. Thank you, and it's an honor to be here. And I want also to repeat what Jack said, that I do not speak for U.S. government or Department of Defense. Everything I say is my own opinion. Also, I want to highlight what Jack said about continuity in U.S. policy. Even there is new administration, but there is great deal of continuity between Obama administration and Trump administration. Based on this, and given that it's very sunny, great day, I will give a very optimistic projection that in the next 6 minutes or so, I will argue that U.S.-Iran relations are heading to very good, warm relations. If I am invited here in few years, 2-3 years from now, I believe the topic will be very different. It will be how the two countries are getting along. To build my argument, first I will start with how the two countries perceive each other and perceive themselves. United States perceives itself rightly as global power with global interests all over the world, and we have legitimate interest in protecting our interests all over the world, economic and strategic interests. United States perceives Iran today as main state sponsoring terrorism, and there is concern about Iran's nuclear intentions, and also concern about Iran's intervention in its neighbors' affairs. On the other side, Iran perceives United States as global power, but also there are other global powers like China, like EU, like Russia, that there is no monopoly on power in United States. Iran also perceives itself as the regional power. Even occasionally some Iranian leaders talk about Iran as global power. But at least there is consensus in Iran that Iran is major regional power. And there is good justification, and this is legitimate definition or legitimate ambition. Iran perceives United States, Iran believes United States has never accepted the revolution. From 1979 till today, from Ayatollah Khomeini to Ayatollah Khamenei, the main theme of Iranian policy, United States has never accepted us who we are, Islamic revolution. I'm not sure this is correct. My understanding, United States accepted the revolution. The concern in United States about specific Iranian policy. Anyway, the Iranian national interest, this is how I'm arguing that there is some overlap between Iranians' national interest and United States' national interest. Iranian foreign policy, like any country, is mix of ideology and national interest. Very much like American foreign policy, mix of American values and American national interest. The Iranians, like any people, Iran like any country, I would not use the word hegemony or trying to control other countries, but Iran would like to have more influence in the region, and I do not believe this is different from any country. Iran does not want to occupy any country. Even the Shah, when he was in power, said Iran has enough desert, we don't want more desert. For sure, Iran as Shia power is interested in the well-being of Shia communities all over the world. Like any country in the world, Iran is interested in stability in its neighborhood, Afghanistan, Pakistan, the Gulf region, and economic cooperation. Every country in the world is interested in trade investment. Iran is not different. United States interests in the Middle East have been very steady for a long time. United States interested in stable oil supplies. United States interested in counterterrorism. United States interested in promoting democracy and security of Israel. Again, this basic US interest, oil, counterterrorism, promoting democracy and security of Israel. US and Iran, the interests are not exactly the same, but they are not mutually exclusive. United States, as major oil producing country, is interested in selling oil at a reasonable price. Iran is not UK or Norway, but Iran has more opening than most of its neighbors. Since the revolution 1979 till today, Iran has had election. Again, they are not as free as UK or Denmark or Europe in general, but comparing with the region, it is better than most of its neighbors. Iran and Israel, Iran does not recognize Israel, but Iran does not prepare for war against Israel. Israel is more ideology for Iran than national security. For counterterrorism, it is true that in United States there has not been terrorist attacks sponsored by Iran, but also it is true that Iran has been supporting terrorist organizations who attack the United States and other countries. But given Al-Qaeda and ISIL, Iran as Shia power is main enemy, and the Iranian leaders promote their country as major power against terrorism. This will take us where Iran in its region, the three major pillars in the Middle East, Syria, Iraq, and Egypt, all of them have serious problems. The only certainty about Syria and Iraq now is they will never be back where they were. Syria will never be the same it was before the civil war, the same thing for Iraq. Egypt has serious economic problems. At one point, Egypt was the leader of the Middle East and the Arab world. It is very highly unlikely that Egypt would resume its leadership. Saudi Arabia emerged as the de facto leader of the Islamic world and the Arab world, but low oil prices and potential succession crisis raise question about Saudi leadership. This leaves Iran as an important player in the Middle East and potential leader of the region. Given the time, the way forward, United States and Iran have invested very little in each other. Iran does not have any friends in Washington, D.C., and also United States has no friends in Tehran. In United States, President Trump won because of populism. Make America great again. This means less intervention in foreign crises and more attention to rebuilding America. This means depending on the regional powers to stabilize the region, and this is where Iran is. My last point, United States is the global power, the strongest military in the world, the largest economy in the world, and huge soft power. No country in the world can ignore United States. At the same time, Iran is major regional power. Last panel we heard about Afghanistan. There will not be stability in Afghanistan, in Syria, in Iraq, without reaching some understanding with Iran. Thank you.
Thank you, Gawdat, and thank you for sticking to time. Our last speaker on the panel is Professor John Wood. Over to you.
Well, thanks very much, and thank you, Antoine, and thanks very much to IISS for a very gracious invitation and the opportunity to speak about the emerging contours of the Trump administration. We do not have a crystal ball up here, but we will try to help you in any regard. I'll give you the same disclaimer as Jack and Dr. Bahgat. I too am speaking only on my own behalf and not representing the United States government, the Department of Defense, or the U.S. National Defense University. Now, look, this is not unique that the three of us would say that right now. We do not fear for our jobs. I would have said the same thing were I here a year ago.
Or 10 years ago.
Or 10 years ago is exactly what I have to. So that's our boilerplate disclaimer. Much as Jack has noted, we are still in the early days of the Trump administration. Today, if I did my Julian calendar arithmetic correctly, marks just day 76, I believe, of President Trump's term, and much remains to be learned about his policy positions. Now, I am a product of my time in the Pentagon and in the U.S. government under Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, and so I thought maybe it would be useful to use a Rumsfeldian framework to talk about where we're going. So I'm going to talk about some known knowns, some known unknowns, and then very briefly about unknown unknowns, and what we might be able to learn about the emerging contours if we look through that framework. So what do we know? And I apologize up front for focusing considerably early on here on personalities, but people give us an insight into where potentially the policies may be headed. So what do we know? Well, we know the national security team that's forming. We know Secretary of Defense Mattis. We know that he has deep Afghan experience. We know that he has broad regional experience, including dealing on the issues of Iran, but also very intimately with the issues of Pakistan as his days as the CENTCOM commander. We know, and in fact Jack and I very personally know, the National Security Advisor, Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster. We know that he has deep Afghanistan experience. And we know one of the senior directors for the region, Brigadier General Robin Fontes, who has extensive Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India experience. She just departed India as our defense attaché. And we have heard this morning of a report, which I have not yet been able to confirm, that our colleague Lisa Curtis from the Heritage Foundation may be going to the National Security Council as well. And we expand this out a little bit. We know Secretary of State Tillerson, but what we don't know with great contours is what's going to happen with the Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. That the office remains, but we don't know what contours that will take. And then if we expand it out just a little bit farther, even our Secretary of Homeland Security, former Marine General Kelly, has some familiarity with the region. Most certainly the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Joe Dunford, former ISAF commander, has broad and deep experience in Afghanistan, as does the Chief of Staff of the United States Army, Mark Milley. So we know there's a real depth of Afghanistan experience at the very high level of the United States government and within the Security Council sphere. We also know Secretary Tillerson's most recent comments at the NATO Ministerial about continued support to the Resolute Support Mission and continued support for, ultimately, a political solution to the situation in Afghanistan, which is not a departure from any of our policy positions in the past. We know General John Nicholson's 9 February testimony to the Senate Armed Services Committee, where he characterized the situation in Afghanistan presently as a stalemate and where he pressed for a need for increased cooperation with Pakistan. We can debate the first comment, but the second comment is a rephrasing of a long-standing policy position in the United States. He made a request, although only at the instigation of a question from the senators, for what has been interpreted as several thousand more troops in Afghanistan, but not a surge-like increase of 30,000 or more. And we know that he's made in recognition of ISIS and Daesh in Afghanistan and Pakistan region. We know General Votel, the CENTCOM commander's testimony, and as well as comments made by Secretary Mattis, that support General Nicholson's positions in front of the Senate, and we know that the United States has every intention to continue the financial commitment to the Train, Advise, and Assist mission and to the Afghan National Army the fund that pays the Army. So, as Jack has alluded to, as Gawdat has mentioned, I think we should expect a great deal of continuity with the U.S. policies going forward. We also know, however, that the Afghan National Unity Government continues to struggle. And I'll leave it at that. We can talk about it perhaps in the question and answer. We know that external actors continue to try to take advantage of the uncertainty in Afghanistan. And we know the Afghan government presently is too weak and the Taliban remain too strong to compel any meaningful reconciliation. Now let's turn for just a second to the known unknowns. What we do not know. We do not know whether there will be yet another strategic review, and if so, what that might do to timelines and budgets. We do not know who the U.S. ambassador will be to Afghanistan. Ambassador Hugo Lawrence is there now as a chargé, or how long it may be before a nomination is placed before the Senate. We do not know what may happen to the Special Representative's office or that structure, and quite frankly, from the rumors that I've heard from my friends in Washington, we're not yet sure what's really going to happen with the bureaucratic structure at the State Department. We don't know yet the Assistant Secretary levels in the Department of Defense nor the State Department. We don't know what's really going on inside of the Islamic State Khorasan province, although I think we know that we don't know. All right? And then finally, perhaps the greatest known unknown is that, at least speaking for myself, I don't know where Afghanistan stands in the order of priorities of President Trump. And in a bit of a counterintuitive way, all of these known unknowns also lead me to conclude that there will be more continuity than discontinuity when it comes to Afghanistan. Well, that brings us to the unknown unknowns, and frankly, the easy way out of that one is to say that by definition they're unknowable. So we don't know. But it's worth thinking through this a little bit. Something might, and something may, and perhaps something probably will arise that upsets everything. And we just don't know. And so for us to think that there would be a clear path, a clear sailing on any policy is worth us reminding ourselves that occasionally an issue comes up out of nowhere that upsets the apple cart. So what might we conclude? One, I would say don't expect radical changes to U.S. policy or strategy, at least regarding Afghanistan in the short term. Number two, any changes to the U.S. troop levels, funding commitments, etc., will be incremental and marginal. There will be no surge. The numbers are not likely to go down and only likely to go up by a few thousand at most. Number three, I think expect a focus, at least in the coming months, on the military aspects and troop numbers at the expense of items of real substantive discussions about governance, regional dynamics, economics, or developmental issues. Military numbers are easy to understand, they're easy to portray, you can get your head around them easily, you can talk to Congress easily about them, but in my humble opinion, the more thorny issues are where real progress and the potential for real progress lies, and that's with improved governance and the economy. And then number four, it's unlikely to see any radical change to the policy of the past regarding strikes into Pakistan. So what should we be watching for? I think we should be watching for key indicators at the bureaucratic level. That'll give us some sense of where the policy is going to go. What happens to the special representative structure and the South and Central Asia Bureau at the State Department? We ought to be paying close attention to where or whether the U.S. Congress increases any attention on Afghanistan. We ought to watch very closely what's happening in Iraq and Syria with respect to the counter-ISIL fight, not just for the sake of countering ISIL, but because that theater, much as it did 10 years ago, has every potential to draw critical resources away that should the President or the Secretary of Defense want to shift resources back into Afghanistan, the availability of those resources will hinge largely on what's happening in Iraq and Syria. I think we need to watch very closely, as Jack has mentioned, the relationship with Russia and China, but we also need to watch very carefully what's going on between Russia and Afghanistan, China and Afghanistan, Russia and the Taliban, and China and the Taliban. And then finally, I would say we need to keep a very close eye on East Asia and in particular North Korea. If there's one area that I think is bubbling right now that could be one of those unknown unknowns in a way, it may be the actions of Kim Jong-un and the North Koreans. So, the last panel on narcotics I found fascinating, but I was also struck at how much the discussions were in some cases almost verbatim to discussions that I was party to in 2005, 2006, and 2007. The same issues, the same debates, the same prescriptions. The scale is just much different. I think we find ourselves in much the same position on a macro level. So 15 and a half years now for the United States in this trip in Afghanistan, 2,386 killed in the United States military, another 1,173 deaths of our contractors, 456 deaths among the UK military. So this is not an endeavor that we will take lightly, and not one that even this new administration would be quick to abandon. We're happy to discuss the current situation in Afghanistan, but as far as U.S. policy, I think expect the status quo for the foreseeable future. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, John. We now have 25 minutes until the end of our session, 25 minutes for discussion. I'd like to perhaps ask you the first question before we open up. And that is a very simple factual question. You've all covered different bilateral relationships, Afghanistan, India, Pakistan, Iran, with the US. Do we have a good sense of what level of incoming visits there have been in the last few months into Washington from all these countries? And do these visits matter or mean anything at this stage?
Yeah, I think we do have a good sense for India and Pakistan. As I mentioned, the Indian National Security Advisor was just in Washington, I think, last week. The Foreign Secretary was in Washington the beginning of March and had been in Washington, if I'm not mistaken, late in 2016 as well. So very, very senior representatives from the Indian government, as well as phone calls between the U.S. Defense Minister or Defense Secretary and the Indian Defense Minister, and a phone call from the President to Prime Minister Modi. So there's been a lot of senior contact, and I think it does matter. I think it's very clearly an effort on the Indian government's part to reach out to the new incoming U.S. administration, and a U.S. The same on the U.S. side, and likewise, senior representative from Pakistan, Ambassador Tariq Fatemi, was in Washington for a considerable period of time, and there have been phone calls back and forth as well. Additionally, General Nicholson, I know, from Afghanistan, has gone to Pakistan probably twice in the past 2 or 3 months. So there's a constant back and forth there on the military level to talk to his Pakistani military counterparts. And again, I think that those kind of that outreach does matter as the various countries attempt to gain an appreciation for what the contours of new U.S. policy will be.
Thank you.
Yeah, I don't think it's been as robust on the Afghan side, but part of that is because of the nature of the relationship and the presence of a U.S. 4-star commander in the country. But having said that, there have been lower level, almost a constant flow from Afghanistan into the United States at a lower level, not the highest levels of the government. So I think that there is a robust dialogue. I think that there are that the positions of President Ghani are pretty well understood by that litany of senior people that I went through. So I think that there's great continuity there, and I'd look for a visit there sometime probably over the next 12 months, but it may not have been as high on the list for either side, quite frankly, as some of the other nations, because there is this constant dialogue.
For Iran, President Rouhani has not visited Washington yet.
I have noticed. Mar-a-Lago, maybe.
But on the other side, there have been important visits. Just 2 days ago, Washington Post reported that the President of UAE visited D.C. basically to drive wedge between Iran and Russia to try to get Trump administration to drive wedge between Iran and Russia. Also, the Deputy Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman visited Washington, basically trying to reverse Obama administration policy. Obama administration policy was Iran is part of the region, Saudi Arabia has to find a way to work with Iran. And the Deputy Crown Prince was trying to push Trump administration in the other direction. It is too early to see how Trump administration will choose its way.
Thank you. I have had a number of hands raised. In order of appearance, I'd like to call on you, sir, first. Could you please identify yourself?
Mahmoud Ali, member of this institute who served in 2 South Asian armies and engaged in some sort of combat with the third 46 years ago. So I'm really fascinated by what you said. The question is this: where does the locus of policy making with regard to the region lie? Is it in Secretary Tillerson offices, or is it in the White House? Is it the Pentagon, or is there some sort of whole of government approach as far as the region is concerned? That's one. And the other great unknown is for Dr. Bahgat. You mentioned while comparing and contrasting American and Iranian interests, you talked about promotion of democracy. And this is a very well known and understood U.S. interest for many, many decades. Does this affect American policy towards the Gulf Cooperation Council member states at all, or not? Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to take another question from Dr. Gautam Sen.
Professor Excellency, the several decades I've been observing Indo-US relations, I think there's total transformation. My conversations with many people in Delhi, but there are 3 things which worry them. The first is if India is to play an important role in promoting peace and stability in the region, harming its principal adversary seems to curtail that ability. Secondly, there is concern and there is awareness of the most rational solution for the US with regard to China is reaching an understanding and condominium, which will be at the expense of all its Asian allies. The second one. The third is, what about this known unknown of another Mumbai? Because then I think many bets are off the table.
Do you have a question?
That's it. And I would like to respond
Okay.
response to that.
Thank you. Would anyone like to take this?
I'll take the question on locus of government policy. I'm going to give you a wholly unsatisfactory answer.
Thank you.
I'm going to say that it depends. And you know, I started off my remarks by listing a fairly lengthy list of personalities, and I did that specific to Afghanistan, right? And so I think that's kind of how you have to parse just about everything in the current emerging Trump administration. So I think if it's a security specific or a defense specific issue, I am pretty confident that Secretary Mattis and General McMaster and others, even many in the State Department, would still have a large voice and be able to help shape a decision or the policy. On other broader issues, I really couldn't answer that. And I think primarily because there's so much focus right now on addressing the campaign promises that the president made, and those campaign promises were almost all domestically driven. And we just have to remember that. And the final part that I say in answer to you is, you said, where's the locus of policy reside? And I would just remind everyone that there's one president of the United States, right? And that ultimately he will be either the person who decides or he'll be the person held accountable for whatever decision emanates from the government. So, you know, having worked at the NSC for several years, you know, it was probably kind of interesting. You know, you have to remind yourself that nobody makes policy in the White House except for one person, and that's the President of the United States.
Should we then worry a little? Sorry.
Well, and I would add that if you look at the constellation of international issues with which the U.S. has to deal, South Asia at present is not at the top of that list. And as John mentioned, North Korea, Syria, Iraq, Russia, there are a lot of other issues that the government is going to be dealing with on a higher priority and more urgent sort of basis. And that does not put South Asia in that list. Another Mumbai might bring it to the top of the list. Heaven forbid that something dreadful like that would happen again. That's certainly in no one's, at least in no rational government's interest that something like that would take place again. But the other 2 points, Professor Sen, you mentioned, I mean, these are standard challenges. People on the outside trying to deal with India and Pakistan, or in the U.S. case, working with China, and at the same time, policies that deal with long-standing critical treaty allies across Southeast Asia and East Asia. These are not new challenges that the United States has to navigate.
About the question who makes the decision, not only in Washington but in Tehran and in other countries, I believe it is deliberate confusion. In Iran also, nobody knows who makes the decision. Is it the supreme leader, the foreign ministry, the president, the Republican guards? And at the end, each institution makes part of the decision. About United States and promoting democracy in the Gulf, American foreign policy reflects American values and American national interest. And I believe sincerely that United States tries to promote democracy in the Gulf and in the rest of the world. Just sometimes private diplomacy works better than public diplomacy. The British Prime Minister is in Saudi Arabia today, and I suppose she is doing the same thing, private diplomacy, to promote democracy.
Thank you. I now have 4 people on my list. The first person to catch my eye was the gentleman on the second row.
No.
Could you please identify yourself?
I'm Jamshed Safarov from the Embassy of Uzbekistan. I have a question for Mr. Wood, please. You mentioned about watching the Russian and Chinese policy towards Afghanistan, which presumably would also impact the American policy in the region. So I would appreciate if you can elaborate a little bit, specifically on 2 points. would you see the prospects of Washington, Beijing, and Moscow working jointly on peace negotiations process in Afghanistan? And second, what would be the American attitude to the current efforts of China to develop infrastructure projects through Central Asia, North Afghanistan and Iran?
Thank you.
Okay.
Shall I take
You want to take another one?
Yeah. To the back, Tim Woolsey.
Tim Woolsey, Stratton Palace. Actually, very similar question. You talk about continuity, Mr. Wood. My question is, with Russia now talking to the Taliban, China and Iran either talking to the Taliban or considering it, these meetings going on in Moscow and so on. Well, there's also a lot of movement there. Where is the US administration vis-a-vis talking to the Taliban now, and how does it perceive the Pakistani attitude?
Thank you. Would either of you like to take that?
Would you want to take another question?
We can.
Wherever you prefer.
Okay.
We can answer these two if you like.
Well, let's have another question. Sir, first one.
I, as member, Gill, in the events, Pakistan-based and supported by its army, Afghan Taliban or Haqqanis inflict severe losses on Afghan forces, especially killing US forces there. What are the chances of President Trump ordering elimination of its bases in Pakistan?
Thank you.
Okay. I'll start with the CPEC question. I don't foresee any major change to the United States approach to China's efforts in the China-Pakistan economic corridor, or quite frankly, to most aspects of One Belt, One Road. Quite frankly, a more economically integrated South Asia, particularly one that's funded by the Chinese and not by the United States, is something that we would gladly welcome. Right? That economic integration is, in my humble opinion, the linchpin to getting a handle on many of the other problems that plague the region. And so I believe that it's been the United States policy under the previous administration, and frankly, because of the contours of the current administration, I frankly don't see any objection to being very supportive of the Chinese efforts regarding CPEC and One Belt, One Road. As I said, there's some little marginal things that I think tend to get blown out of proportion, but on balance, it would be great if it's brought to fruition. The Washington, Beijing, Moscow peace process. I I understand that the United States has declined the 11th hour invitation to go to the upcoming meeting, pushed mainly by the Russians. I think that there's two parts that we have to remind ourselves about this. One is how much substance is there in the efforts that are being touted by the Russians to date, and how much of it is just posturing, how much of it is poking the United States a little bit. I think there's a lot of that. But having said that, I now want to go out of the schoolyard and into the negotiations themselves. Right. So if we can get past the poking each other in the eye piece, I firmly believe that when you look at the blood and treasure that the men and women that I mentioned in my remarks have been part of in Afghanistan, that we would welcome any substantive effort that brings peace to the country. Now, having said that, I have to go back and remind everybody that until the Afghan government is strong enough, and until the Taliban feel themselves so weak that they are then both willing and able to come to the table, any meetings anywhere else in the world are very interesting, but perhaps marginally irrelevant. I think we are very concerned about the reports that are beginning to emerge, although I can't say personally whether I see any factual basis to them or not. I'm no longer privy to the intelligence feeds that perhaps there once was. But when I hear the NATO Supreme Allied Commander saying we really need to be worried about the Russian support to the Taliban, that leads me to think that there must be some credible evidence there. I mean, that's the degree that we ought to be particularly paying attention to. I'm much more worried about that and see the talks themselves as sort of marginal, because that central issue of the strength of the Afghan government, the weakness of the Taliban, has not changed. And I'll let my colleagues talk about the Haqqanis.
Yeah, I guess in that sense, how would the U.S. respond? I personally don't like to deal in hypotheticals, because everything is so dependent upon the exact nature of what transpires, what kind of information you have. Can you authoritatively say, yes, this attack came from this place, and therefore, if we make the following action, it will have an impact and not see a repeat of that kind of attack, or it will punish the perpetrators. So without having real specifics, it's very difficult to say anything. I would only offer that I think as now and as in the previous administration, more or less all kinds of options are on the table, but it all depends on what the provocation is and what the information is that surrounds that provocation. And for our friend from Uzbekistan, as I mentioned, there is some talk in Pakistan today, this morning, of trying to revive the quadrilateral consultative group. That's United States, China, Pakistan, Afghanistan, as a means to create a space in which there could be discussions with the Taliban. Whether that prospers or not is very much open to question. Personally, I'm very skeptical, but that would be wonderful if it did. But it's been a year and a half, almost 2 years, since there was anything productive out of that quadrilateral group for a variety of reasons, and we'll just have to see how that initiative, if it is true, evolves.
Antoine, can I get a two-finger on this? I wasn't going to talk about the Haqqani question, but I do want to throw in one observation here. We've been talking about the Trump administration, but let's remind ourselves that the executive branch is only one of 3 parts of the United States government, and the United States Congress continues to show a lot of interest in what's happening, and in particular, very close interest in Pakistan. And for all of the things that Washington is split between the Republicans and the Democrats over, I've been struck by the recent Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearing on Pakistan, where the Republican chairman and the Democratic ranking member had almost identical opening statements, and they were very, very critical of Pakistan. And so the area that maybe you should also be watching is not just the Trump administration, but what kind of direction the United States Congress continues to go. I think that would be another place to watch for an answer to your question.
Thank you, sir.
If I may.
Thank you, please.
United States takes inclusive approach to political and economic issues. As far as I understand, U.S. does not have any objection to Russian, Chinese, European role in stabilizing Pakistan, Afghanistan, Syria or Iraq. For economic cooperation, U.S. as the largest economy in the world is interested in stability all over the world. It is good for American economy, good for American business. If China wants to invest in Pakistan, this means better economic prosperity for the 2 countries, more jobs for Pakistanis. This is good for the United States. So probably in my mind, it is not zero-sum game, it is win-win game.
Thank you. We are approaching the end of our hour, but I still have 4 names on my list, and I'd like to give the opportunity to everyone to ask the question. The first name I have is our colleague Ben Barry.
I'm from the ISS. On Pakistan, it strikes me there are some other known unknowns, which do signify a shift in direction. First of all, the expulsion of the Afghan refugees, which is also linked to what appears to be a serious heavyweight effort to close the border apart from a small number of legal crossings and to beef up the presence on the Afghan-Pakistan border. And then there's a long-term development, which is the decision by the government to modernise the status of the federally administered tribal areas and integrate them properly into the body of Pakistan provincial government. Do those affect your assessments at all?
Thank you. Dawood Azami.
I work in the media. You add a couple of more unknowns. You can put them in known unknowns. There's Russia-Pakistan relations, which are warm, is something new. I haven't seen this for the past 70 years. And then the tensions in Russian-India relations, which is also something new. So what would be the impact of these developments on regional politics? And the second question is about the point you made about continuity. Yes, there is continuity, and we expect continuity, but this continuity is not changing the situation in Afghanistan in favor of the government, because the Taliban control has increased over the past 2 years, and we expect that this fighting season might be even tougher. And until 2 years ago, there was no ISIS. Now it's another ballgame in that region, that part of the world. Another problem, a new problem. Public cultivation has been increasing, and you might call it a stalemate, but it's usually hurting stalemate. And some might say that it's in favor of Taliban, at least in some provinces, because in the north there was peace. Now north is also unstable. So would you still call it continuity, and where does it end?
Thank you. And the last two people, Pierre Noël at the end.
Yes, from the IISS. Just could you please update us on the US-Indian Maritime Cooperation and what drives it and will drive it under the Trump administration?
Thank you. And finally, the gentleman at the end down there.
Hi, my name is Akeem Wallace from Defense Corporate Specialist. My question is again maybe on the unknown hypothetical type situation. If there is a crisis that arises, and as you mentioned, there's a lack of depth in the State Department, the only transnational kind of US body that could deal with it would be one of the military commands. So bearing in mind also the heavy preponderance of military officials in the State, in the Defense Department, etc., in the Trump administration, what do you think are the risks or the rewards of there being a military response to any crisis that arises in the South Asia region? Do you think there's risks or rewards, or it would just be more or less continuation of the same under another guise?
Thank you. Let's go.
Maybe we should start with
Yeah,
this time.
please. Can you take
anything you want to add? Or?
Probably you start that.
You want to wrap it up?
That'll be very easy.
No, I mean you want to.
Okay, that sounds good. Sure.
So I'll make my parts of it very short because most of it I think actually pertains more to Pakistan and India, and then we'll let Jack have the last word. If I understood your question properly, and I admit that I don't hear all that well, I think that you were implying that the plethora of military and former military and the senior advisory roles of the current Trump administration would yield a tendency to lean toward a military response more so than another kind of response, to which I would say not so fast. I think, and as a former Army officer myself for nearly 30 years, we're the only profession in the world that trains and practices every day and prays every night that we don't get used. And I mean that sincerely. And so the fact that Joe Dunford's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, or that Secretary Mattis is the Secretary of Defense, in many ways to me means they will be more hesitant to argue for the use of force, not more hesitant to argue for the use of force, not more likely to argue for the use of force. So I wanted to get that part in there. Sir, you're exactly right. One of my greatest frustrations, having been involved in one form or another with U.S. policy with Afghanistan, in one way or another since about 2003, is that we've not made more progress collectively, all of us together, than we have. And so the purposes of speaking today were to talk about potential changes or not with U.S. policy, not whether or not the policies were yielding the right results. And there are many areas where I would be quite sympathetic that we, all of us together, and for lots of reasons, many of them well-intentioned, are just not where we ought to be.
Thank you.
For Iran, I started giving projection for long term. For short term, there is no immediate crisis with Iran. the Iranians believe in very long term and love patience, and there is a presidential election next month in Iran, and it looks the nuclear deal is on, and good news, just yesterday US Congress decided not to impose sanctions on Iran, waiting for the election. So it seems the two sides are keeping close eye on each other. I do not expect any immediate crisis in US-Iran in the next few months.
Thank you. Jack?
Okay, very quickly. Ben, great questions as always. I think I can divide it into two bits. One is the good and the other is the bad. It's the simple black and white. The good side is if Pakistan modernizes and incorporates FATA, the federally administered tribal areas, into mainstream Pakistan, for as far as most Americans would be concerned, that's a good thing. And the United States has provided economic and developmental assistance in the past on road building and wells and that education, that sort of thing. That would be a benefit to the people who live there in the first instance, but to larger regional stability, I think. On the bad side is the spike in Pakistan-Afghanistan friction that we've seen, exemplified by the two things you pointed out. There is some hope that might be on the way to improving slowly, but the tensions are very deep-rooted, and that will be a long time shifting. But the Pakistan National Security Advisor and the Afghan ambassador in Islamabad have met recently, and there's some sort of favorable sounds coming from the senior Pakistan Foreign Ministry people. So that might be on the way to some slight improvement, but the depth of enmity is a real challenge. Russia's role, I would not overplay either one, either Russia-Pakistan or Russia-India. If we look at what Russia has, now it is different. We don't want to miss it or lose sight of something that might evolve. But if we look at what has Russia done, well, they've had one military exercise, even though the Indians objected. What did that military exercise consist of? I don't know, 24 guys from Russia go to Pakistan, have some exchange training. Not a big deal. 4 helicopters, count them all 4. If you had 4 helicopters, how many do you think are flying at any one time? Maybe 2? So not a big deal. Symbolic, yes. And we don't want to underplay or ignore or just wash over it, but I wouldn't read too much in. And the obverse applies to Russia and India, in my view. U.S.-India maritime cooperation, this is a great question. There's not enough time to answer it, and I haven't really prepared, but I can give you some sources that have done some really good analysis of this. I think you can say it has been very good, a foundation of the U.S.-India defense relationship, very good relations between the two navies, and incorporating multilateral aspects as well, particularly with Japan and Australia, possibly with others looking to the future. But because it really has been a foundational piece of the U.S.-India defense relationship, I think that will continue, and it's in the interests of both countries that it do so.
Thank you. We are now over time, but I think that is a reflection of how rich the conversation has been and how many questions we all had in that regard. So I'd like to invite you to join me in thanking our panelists for an excellent conversation.
Thank you.